But to consider the shape of the organism as such and the inner qua inner merely of the shape is in fact no longer to consider organic being. For the two aspects which were supposed to be related are posited as merely indifferent towards each other, with the result that the reflection into self, which constitutes the essence of the organism, is done away with. What really happens here is that the attempted comparison of inner and outer is transferred to inorganic nature. Here the infinite notion is only the essence which is concealed within, or falls without in self-consciousness, and no longer, as in the organism, is objectively present. The relation of inner and outer has thus still to be considered in its own proper sphere. Paragraph 287 is rather short, and unlike many of the shorter paragraphs, there's not an awful lot going on in there, so it doesn't require too much commentary. Hegel is telling us that we're considering the inner and the outer in their relationship to each other. That's what's been going on throughout these previous paragraphs. And he says to consider the shape, the gestalt, and I put here gestaltung as well because that's what we've been talking about so far. To betrachten, right? To consider, to handle this exterior, the outer part of the organic being, the organism. To consider the shape of the organism as such and the inner merely of the shape, he says, is no longer in fact to consider organic being. We've seen him say this at a number of points already. The cadaver is not the animal, the dissection is not the living organism, and we can go on from there. So he says, the two aspects which were supposed to be related are what? Posited as merely indifferent to each other. The outer in relation to the inner, the entire outer in relation to the entire inner. They lose their connection. What connection are they losing? Remember, the outer was supposed to be in some way the expression of the inner, but now we're finding that that's not holding up, and we're starting to despair of having laws about these. So he says that the reflection into self, which constitutes the essence of the organism, ends up being done away with. We end up with something that we can cognize, but something that in the act of cognizing we in effect lose hold of. We substitute something else for it. What he's been calling in these earlier paragraphs leading up to this, number, and in the paragraphs yet to come, he's going to talk about in terms of specific gravity and cohesion and certain properties like that were being used by the science and the philosophy of science, particularly that of Kant and that of Schelling of his time. And it's not really that interesting to go into the details about that, in part because what we want to see is, well, what is Hegel driving at? So he tells us what happens here is that the attempted comparison of inner and outer gets transferred to inorganic nature. We start to treat these things as if they were within the same domain as, say, chemistry. Biology reduces to chemistry, you might say, or to physics. So he says the infinite notion is only the essence which is concealed within, or falls without in self-consciousness, right? It could be outside, and no longer, as in the organism, is objectively present. So this is a problem. So he says this relationship of inner and outer has to be considered in its own proper sphere, and that is where he leaves off this paragraph with something yet to come. In the first place, that inner aspect of shape as the simple singularity of an inorganic thing is specific gravity. As a simple being, it can be observed just as well as the determinateness of number, of which alone it is capable, or, strictly speaking, it can be found by comparing observations, and seems in this way to give one aspect of the law. Shape, color, hardness, toughness, and a countless host of other properties would together constitute the outer aspect, and would have to give expression to the determinateness of the inner, that is number, so that the one would have its counterpart in the other. Here in paragraph 288, we get to see a little bit of what we might call the weirdness of Hegel in dealing with natural sciences raising its head. Because he's going to talk in terms of something that some of us are familiar with already, that is specific gravity, or specifika schwere, literally the specific weight or heaviness of something. And that's a term that doesn't really mean the same thing exactly, at least in its full significance, for Hegel as it does in the present for us, where, for example, I've run into this in terms of home brewing, and there we're thinking about it in a somewhat different way. So I don't want people to get too caught up on the mechanics of this, and I want you to think rather instead of what is Hegel actually driving at here, and how might we extend this discussion, which is going to have to do with specific gravity, and then these other qualities, and then something else, cohesiveness. How might these apply in other forms today? So in this paragraph, he talks about specific gravity. He says that inner aspect of shape as the singularity of an inorganic thing is specific gravity. Right? So we're treating it as the organism as an inorganic thing, and we're assigning to it some number. So why is this important? Well, this was seen in the science of Hegel's time as one way to get a handle on the incredible variety of life. And one way you can think of specific gravity, at least what the commentators, when they're talking about this, like Hippolyte, have to tell us about this, is that they're looking at the relationship between, volume and mass, and they're interested in that for organisms. And there was this notion, which seems completely unworkable, when you actually plot it out. Hegel's going to say it's completely unworkable, that somehow we could associate particular numbers of this sort with particular organisms. And that really doesn't seem to hold up, but that was part of the idea at the time, and Hegel's going to criticize that, not just by saying, what are you guys talking about, but by connecting it to other things. So he says, okay, so you've got that as the inner, that's fine, right? And then he says, what else? Then what about the outer? So he says, shape, color, hardness, toughness, and a countless host of other properties. There's a little bit of irony there because I know unzählige, innumerable, and unnumberable menge, crowd of other properties, right? We have all these other things that are characteristic of the outside of the organism or of the thing. And the question then is, well, how are they related to specific gravity, this number that we have? And he says, these would have to give expression to the determinateness of the inner, that is number, so that the one would have its counterpart in the other. There's supposed to be some sort of correlation between the two of these. And now we have to see, well, is there actually such a correlation? Now, because negativity is understood here not as a movement of the process, but as a unity brought to rest or as a simple being for self, it appears rather as that by which the thing resists the process and inwardly preserves itself, as indifferent towards it. But in virtue of the fact that this simple being for self is a tranquil indifference towards an other, specific gravity appears as one property alongside others, and with that all necessary relation of it to this plurality. In other words, all conformity to law ceases. Specific gravity, as this simple inner, does not have the moment of difference within itself. In other words, the difference it has is only unessential, for it is just its pure simplicity that effaces all essential distinction. This unessential difference magnitude must therefore have its counterpart or other in the other aspect, that is the plurality of properties, since it is only through this that it is difference at all. If this plurality itself is concentrated into the simplicity of the antithesis and determined, say, as cohesion, so that this cohesion is a being for self and otherness, just as specific gravity is a pure being for self, then this cohesion is in the first place pure determinateness posited in the notion in contrast to that other
determinateness. And the way of formulating the law would be that which we considered above, in connection with the relation of sensibility to irritability. In the next place, cohesion, qua notion of being for self and otherness, is further only the abstraction of the aspect standing over against specific gravity, and as such has no existence. For being for self and otherness is the process in which the inorganic would have to express its being for self as a self-preservation, which would secure it from emerging from the process as a moment of a product. But just this is contrary to its nature, which has no purpose or universality in it. Its process, rather, is merely the specific activity in which its being for self, that is, its specific gravity, is suspended. But this specific activity itself, in which its cohesion would exist in its true notion, and the specific quantity of its specific gravity, are notions completely indifferent towards each other. If the way in which they react to each other is left out of account and attention is confined to the idea of quantity, we could perhaps think of the determination like this, that a greater specific weight, as a more intensive being within self, would resist involvement in the process more than would a smaller specific weight. But, conversely, the freedom of being for self only proves itself in the ease with which it enters into relation with everything, and preserves itself in this multiplicity. The said intensity without extension of relations is an empty abstraction, for extension constitutes the outer existence of intention. But self-preservation of the inorganic in its relation falls, as we have noted, outside of its nature, since the inorganic does not contain within itself the principle of movement, or in other words, because its being is not absolute negativity and notion.
Paragraph 289 might appear a bit confusing, but you have to keep in mind that what Hegel is actually talking about here is no longer the organic being understood as organic being, what we've been going through in much of this section, but now how we might consider an organic being that has this being for self in terms of the inorganic nature that its exterior is connected up with, and what observation of nature might want to try to reduce it to in order to make it amenable to law. Hegel is going to show us here one reason why that sort of dream or ideal, or you might even call it reductive strategy, is going to have to fail. And he's doing it in terms of, as we've remarked, this weird notion of specific gravity that is running through some of what's passing for the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of science, the science of nature of the time. And you don't want to get too caught up in worrying about that, but pay attention to what's actually being discussed here. He says, so negativity, and I don't have negativity on the board, in part because I don't really want to bring it in at this point, but he says negativity is understood here not as a movement of the process, right? Not as organic, but as a unity brought to rest, or as a simple being for self. So we're taking this complex idea of negativity in Hegel and trying to smooth it out, sort of flatten it out here, as something that we can really essentially make positive. And he says, it appears as that by which the thing resists the process inwardly preserves itself as indifferent towards that process. So what is it that remains the same in the process? That's part of what we're getting at. And he says, in virtue of the fact that this simple being for self is a tranquil indifference towards an other, specific gravity appears as one property alongside others. So what we've got here, we said that specific gravity could be identified in the last paragraph with the inner, and it still remains, the inner of the outer, right? But then we have this whole plurality of properties, what in the last paragraph he called the whole mess, unnumberable crowd of them, hardness, shape, color, these sorts of things. When we're thinking about organic being, we can talk about the color of an animal, but really we're talking about the color of parts of the animal, usually its skin, right? We're not talking about everything else. It's got a lot of different colors, and that's only animals that are fairly monochromatic. So what we're really thinking about here is more inorganic substances. And Hegel is going to explore the relation between these now. So he says, simple, specific gravity, right, would have some sort of relation with these other properties. If it doesn't, then our notion of law ceases. So we want to have some sort of connection between them. So he says, specific gravity does not have the moment of difference within itself. Why? The difference it has is only unessential. It's just number. It's pure simplicity that effaces all essential distinction, he says. So what is this? We've already seen this many times, number or magnitude. And that, for Hegel, looks like it's scientific, looks like it's amenable to being turned into laws, but turns out not to be the basis for laws. So he goes on and he says, this unessential difference must have its counterpart or other in the other aspect, the plurality of properties. These stand over against it, since it is only through this that it's difference at all, right? If this plurality itself is concentrated into the simplicity of the antithesis and determined, say, as cohesion, now cohesion is just an English transliteration of the German, cohesion there. If we're trying to consolidate those into cohesion, or as Hegel's going to call it, the being for self in otherness, we've seen in previous paragraphs that the external, the outer, is in relation to otherness, right? Maybe we have the possibility of some sort of law, a correlation there between specific gravity and cohesion. So is that going to work? He says, how is that going to help? He says, here we go. Cohesion is in the first place pure determinateness posited in the notion in contrast to that other determinateness. And the way of formulating the law would be that which we considered above in connection with the relation of sensibility to irritability. Maybe we could connect these up with what we've been trying to do before. Irritability would be the cohesion, resistance. The sensibility or sensitivity would be the specific gravity. Now we can ask ourselves, how well did that work? We saw it didn't work. We tried a whole bunch of different ways to make that turn into something that would in fact provide us with a law, and we saw that it never really yielded us anything like necessity. It seemed rather arbitrary. Why is that? Well, Hegel's going to give us a little bit of explanation here. He says, cohesion, qua notion of being for self and otherness, is only the abstraction of the aspect standing over against specific gravity. As such, has no existence. For being for self and otherness is the process in which the inorganic would have to express its being for self as a self-preservation, which would secure it from emerging from the process as moment of a product. Inorganic nature wants to preserve itself. Sounds good in terms of cohesion. And then Hegel says, well, that just doesn't happen that way. Why? This is this is contrary to its nature, which has no purpose or universality within it. That's one of the fundamental differences between inorganic nature and organic nature, Hegel says, right? Organic nature actually has purposiveness, teleology. Inorganic nature doesn't have that. It can be brought into a teleology, but it doesn't possess that in and of itself. So he goes on and he says, its process is the specific activity in which it's being for itself. Its specific gravity is suspended. But this itself, in which its cohesion would exist in its true notion and the specific quantity of its specific gravity, are notions, notice he uses notions there in the plural, completely indifferent towards each other. That means, in a certain respect, they're not really notions in any full sense. There's no integration going on. So then he goes on and he says, if the way in which they react to each other is left out of account and attention is confined just to the idea of quantity, we could perhaps think of the determination like this, that a greater specific weight as a more intensive being within itself would resist involvement in the process more than a smaller specific weight. So greater cohesion, right? Maybe there's a correlation between this number and a number that we can assign there. But Hegel says this is precisely where the being for itself rears its ugly head as freedom, or you might say as arbitrariness. There turns out to be no intrinsic connection between specific gravity. And if we understand specific gravity, why would we think that there's a connection between that and cohesion? There's so many other possibilities, all these other factors, that we don't get anything remotely like law-like regularity that we're seeking there, let alone intelligibility. So he goes on and he says, the self-preservation of the inorganic in its relation falls outside of its nature, since the inorganic does not contain within itself the principle of movement, or, in other words, because its being is not absolute negativity and notion. So if we're going to seek out the meaning of this stuff, it's not going to be provided by analogies and observation of inorganic being.
This other aspect of the inorganic, on the other hand, when considered not as process but as a quiescent being, is ordinary cohesion, a simple sensuous property standing over against the liberated moment of otherness, which is separated into a number of mutually indifferent properties, and which, like specific gravity, is one of those properties. The multiplicity of properties together, then, constitutes the other aspect of cohesion. In this, however, as in the other properties, number is the sole determinateness, and this not only does not express a relation between these properties in a transition from one to another, but is essentially just the absence of any necessary relation, and it represents rather the abolition of all conformity to law. For it is the expression of a determinateness that is unessential. This being so, then a series of bodies in which the difference is expressed as a numerical difference of their specific gravities by no means runs parallel to a series in which the difference is that of the other properties, even if to facilitate the comparison, only one or some of them are taken. For, as a matter of fact, only the entire bundle of properties could constitute the other series in such a parallel. To bring this into order and bind it into a whole, observation has at its disposal, on the one hand, the quantitative determinatenesses of these various properties. On the other hand, however, their differences are manifest as qualitative. Now, in this heap of properties, what would have to be characterized as positive or negative and as mutually canceling each other, in general, the internal arrangement and exposition of the formula, which would be a very complicated matter, this would be for the notion to determine. But the notion is excluded by the very manner in which the properties are immediately there and taken up. In this mere being of the properties, none displays the character of a negative over against the other. On the contrary, one is just as well as the other is, nor does it indicate in any other way its place in the arrangement of the whole. In the case of a series which progresses with parallel differences, whether the relation is meant to be one of simultaneous increase on both sides, or of increase only on one and decrease on the other, what is of interest is only the final simple expression of this combined whole, which was supposed to constitute one aspect of the law over against specific gravity. But this one aspect, as a given result, is precisely nothing else than what has already been mentioned, that is, a single property, say like ordinary cohesion, alongside which the indifferent others, specific gravity among them, are found. And each of the others can with equal right, that is, with equal incorrectness, be taken as representative of the entire other side. The one, like the other, would merely represent, in German Vorstellen, the essential nature, but would not itself be that essential nature. So that the attempt to find series of bodies which would run simply parallel to each other and would express the essential nature of the bodies according to a law of these two series must be regarded as a conception that is ignorant of its task and of the means whereby it should be carried out.
In this long paragraph, number 290, a lot of these themes now are being brought together, and we're seeing some, you might say, not just progress being made, but some consolidation of progress, or if you like, some cohesion, if we want to be a little jokey here, since we've already got that on the board. So he says this other aspect of the inorganic is ordinary cohesion, right? And he says this is a simple sensuous property standing over against the liberated moment of otherness. What does he mean by that? Well, the other properties. It stands over against these other observable, sensible properties that are part of the outer. And he says it's separated into a number of mutually indifferent properties, which like specific gravity is one of these properties. So we've got specific gravity, cohesion, all these other properties like hardness, color, and all sorts of things that we now are treating in terms of what we can observe, what we can measure, how we can correlate them to each other. Looks like we're actually making some progress. Are we able to have a law about that? He goes on and he reminds us of why not. He says, the problem is that in this, number is the sole determinateness, and this not only does not express a relation between these properties and a transition from one to the other, but is essentially just the absence of any necessary relation, and it represents rather the abolition of any conformity to law. So because everything is essentially reducible or reduced here to the numerical, we don't get the kind of necessity that law is supposed to bring. We get a lot of information, and we get a lot of correlations between things, but we don't get any sort of intelligibility running through all of that. That would be what Hegel calls the notion. You notice I've got the notion crossed out down here, and we'll see why in just a moment. So he goes on, and I'm going to skip through a bit of this because a lot of it is sort of rehearsing what we've had already. So he says, this being so, now perhaps a series of bodies in which the difference is expressed as a numerical difference of their specific gravities by no means runs parallel to a series in which the difference is that of the other properties. So he's suggesting that the whole point of talking in terms of specific gravity as the number of the kind of thing is going to be lost. So what is he talking about here? He's saying we actually don't get a series like this, but let's do a sort of a thought experiment and assume that we actually could correlate these things to each other. Imagine that we have a whole series of numbers that correspond to specific gravity, and these are going to be specific gravities of particular kinds of things. So we've got A is a number, B is a number, C is a number, D is a number, and these correspond to classes of things, right? And then over here we have all these multiple properties, and I ran out of numbers fairly quickly, in part because I really only know the Roman and the Greek alphabets, and if we had more alphabets at my disposal, and I'm sure somebody will put something in the comments here, I would put a Hebrew number, and then maybe, I don't know, a Cyrillic number, who knows, right? Doesn't matter, you get the idea. These are supposed to be properties that are then somehow correlated. There's a series here, and then a series here. And there's supposed to be some sort of connection or correlation between the two, right? So he says, as a matter of fact, only the entire bundle of properties could constitute the other series in a parallel. To bring this into order and to bind it into a whole, observation has at its disposal, on the one hand, the quantitative determinateness of these various properties, right? So these can be numbered. These can be then arranged in a kind of series with each other. This actually wouldn't be just a series. It'd be something like, we're doing almost something like linear algebra here, right? But Hegel didn't have that at his disposal, so he's thinking about it this way. And he says, on the other hand, their differences are manifest as qualitative. Now that's a problem. So, insofar as these things are being differentiated from each other, number isn't really going to cut it for us. In what they really are, they are qualitatively distinguished from each other, not just quantitatively distinguished from each other. And whatever solution we might try to adapt to this would be rather, as we call it, ad hoc. We're introducing number where number isn't completely appropriate. So he goes on and then he says, in this heap of properties, what would have to be characterized as positive or negative and as mutually canceling each other, if we want to reduce everything down to mathematics, right? This would be for the notion to determine, right? It would be the internal arrangements and exposition of the formula, which would be a very complicated matter. The notion would do this. But when we are engaging in this sort of, thought experiment, we're actually eliminating the notion. We're pushing it out, he says. So he says, the notion is excluded by the very manner in which the properties are immediately there and taken up. In this mere being of the properties, none displays the character of a negative over against the other. They're just different from each other. They're just there. They actually have no connection to each other whatsoever. They're given a connection over here to specific gravity, but in being associated in this series like that, they're disconnected from each other. There's no cohesion, but use that a different word, right, that the notion would be bringing and affording. So he says, so it doesn't indicate in any other way, it's placed in the arrangement of the whole. We're lacking intelligibility here. In the case of a series which progresses with parallel differences, right here, whether the relation is meant to be one of simultaneous increase or increase on one side and decrease on the other, some sort of correlation, what is of interest is only the final simple expression of this combined whole, which was supposed to constitute law, right? But, he says, this one aspect as a given result is precisely nothing else than what was already mentioned, that is a single property, like ordinary cohesion, alongside which the indifferent others are found. And each of the others can, with equal right, that is, with equal incorrectness, be taken as representative of the entire other side. It's totally indifferent what we put here on this side of the series, you could say. We can correlate everything with everything, but in the process, we lose sight of, well, what the hell did all of this mean? What was the significance of that? And, you see this happen an awful lot. I don't want to pick on big data, but there's people that are, sort of fascinated with this in our own time. And they think that, well, we've got a whole array of numbers. They got to mean something. We got to be able to draw some connection somewhere. And that's not always the case. If you don't have something like what Hegel is calling the notion, something bringing them together and providing them with some intelligibility, with some way of parsing the data, as we say, some modes of interpretation, you're going to lose sight of what are you doing in the first place with all of this. And so if we're trying to make sense out of things, organic beings and inorganic beings, that's going to be a problem. So he goes on and he says, this ends up getting us back into just merely representing, and he uses this term repräsentieren, right? And then he says, in German we call that Vorstellung, and we've talked about this a number of times already. When we don't have the concept, the notion, the Begriff, that way of approaching things, we turn things into mere representation, and the understanding is often very happy with that, but reason is not. And remember, this section is observing reason, not just, hey, the understanding goes to town. So he goes on and he says, the attempt to find series of bodies which would run simply parallel to each other, and which would also express the essential nature of the bodies according to the law of these two series, must be regarded as a conception that is ignorant of its task and of the means whereby it should be carried out. He's saying that this way, this mode of looking at things is sort of a cookie-cutter approach that cannot give us what it is that we are looking for in observing natural things.